The oak doors of Carinhall groaned as they swung open, admitting a cold November wind that carried the scent of pine and impending snow. Hermann Goring sat behind his ornate desk, surrounded by Renaissance paintings and marble busts that spoke of empire and permanence. The year was 1943, and the Reichsmarshal of the Greater German Reich was reviewing reports that should have filled him with confidence. Instead, a single document lay before him, its typed words seemingly impossible, its implications catastrophic. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The paper trembled slightly in his thick fingers. 8 Essex-class aircraft carriers. Commissioned. In a single year. The Americans had done what the entire German naval command had deemed fantasy, what every calculation had proven mathematically improbable. Goring's jaw clenched as he read the names again. Essex, Yorktown, Intrepid, Hornet, Franklin, Ticonderoga, Randolph, Lexington. 8 floating cities of steel and aviation fuel, each capable of carrying nearly 100 aircraft, each displacing over 27,000 tons, each representing an industrial achievement that defied every assumption the Reich had made about American capability. "It cannot be accurate," he muttered, though he knew Admiral Donit's intelligence network was thorough. His aide, Oberst Klaus Richter, stood at attention near the door, his face carefully neutral. Richter had been with Goring since the early days, had flown reconnaissance missions over England, had seen the Reichsmarshal transform from a lean fighter ace to this corpulent administrator of impossible promises. Richter knew better than to contradict the report, but he also knew Goring well enough to understand that denial would give way to rage, and rage to something far more dangerous, acceptance. The morning light filtered through stained glass windows, casting colored shadows across maps of Europe where tiny flags marked victories that now seemed hollow. Goring rose from his chair with effort, his once athletic frame now burdened by weight gained from medication and excess. He walked to the window, gazing out at the frozen lake that surrounded his estate. Deer grazed at the tree line, unaware of the calculations that were crumbling in the mind of the man watching them. "How?" Goring asked, not turning from the window. "We were told their shipyards were scattered, their workforce undisciplined, their industrial capacity stretched thin by supplying the British and Russians. We were told it would take them 18 months to build a single carrier of this class." Richter stepped forward, holding a supplementary folder. "The intelligence indicates prefabrication techniques we had not anticipated, Herr Reichsmarschall. The Americans divided the construction process into modular sections. Different shipyards built different components simultaneously. When assembled at the primary yards, Newport News, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, the carriers came together like puzzles." He paused, searching for words that wouldn't inflame his superior. They worked 24 hours a day, in 3 shifts. Women comprised a significant portion of the workforce. They called them Rosie the Riveter. Songs were written about them. Goring laughed bitterly, a sound like grinding gears. Songs. They build warships and write songs. He turned back to face Richter, and in that moment, the Oberst saw something he had not seen before in his commander's eyes. Genuine fear masquerading as contempt. "Do you understand what this means, Klaus? Not just for the Kriegsmarine, but for everything we have told the Führer, everything we have promised about American weakness." The room fell silent except for the ticking of an ornate French clock. Goring moved back to his desk and lifted another document, a transcript of his own words from a speech given in 1940. He read aloud, his voice dripping with mockery of his former self. "The Americans cannot even organize their own cities, much less an industrial war effort. They are a mongrel nation of shopkeepers and cowboys, incapable of the discipline required for total war." He let the paper fall. "I said this. I believed this. The Führer believed this because I told him to believe it." Richter remained silent. There was nothing to say that would not make the situation worse. Outside, a raven landed on the windowsill, its black eyes seeming to peer into the room with ancient knowledge. Goring noticed it and felt an involuntary shudder. His mother had been superstitious, had taught him that ravens were messengers, though messengers of what? She had never been clear. "Bring me everything," Goring said suddenly, his voice taking on a manic edge. "I want production figures for every American shipyard. I want to know how many workers they have, how they trained them, where they sourced the steel. I want to know how they coordinated across an entire continent without the central planning we possess. I want to understand how a democracy, with all its chaos and debate, outproduced the Reich." Richter nodded and turned to leave, but Goring's voice stopped him. "And Klaus? Say nothing of this to anyone. Not yet. I need to understand the scope before I report to the Führer." His hand moved unconsciously to the morphine pills in his desk drawer, a habit born of injury and pain that had become dependency. "We must determine if this is an anomaly or a pattern. Because if it is a pattern, if the Americans can do this with carriers, they can do it with tanks, with aircraft, with everything we need to win this war." After Richter departed, Goring sat alone with the impossible report. He thought back to the Great War, when he had been young and vital, when he had shot down 22 enemy aircraft and earned the Pour le Mérite. He remembered the American pilots he had faced occasionally. Brave enough, but their machines had been inferior, their tactics unrefined. That America had been a sleeping giant, yes, but one that stirred slowly, that took years to mobilize, that could be defeated before it fully awakened. But this report spoke of a different America. This was a nation that had learned from the last war, that had somehow found a gear no one knew existed. Goring pulled out a leather-bound journal where he kept private notes, observations he dared not share even with Richter. He began to write, his handwriting growing more erratic as the implications cascaded through his mind. If they can build 8 carriers in 1 year, what will they build in 2 years? In 3? We have been fighting on the assumption that time is on our side, that we can consolidate our gains, that the Americans will exhaust themselves in the Pacific against Japan while we secure Europe. But what if time is their weapon? What if every month we delay brings not attrition but multiplication of their strength? He paused, staring at the words he had written. In the margin, he sketched rough calculations. 8 carriers meant approximately 800 aircraft. Each aircraft required fuel, ammunition, trained pilots, maintenance crews, spare parts. The logistical web was staggering. And if the Americans could coordinate that level of complexity for 8 carriers in 1 year, what did that say about their ability to support multiple theaters of war simultaneously? The afternoon shadows lengthened across Carinhall. Goring ordered his staff not to disturb him, claiming he was reviewing strategic bombing reports. In truth, he was spiraling through a crisis of comprehension. Everything he had built his reputation upon, his mastery of air power, his understanding of industrial warfare, his assurances to Hitler that the Luftwaffe could defend the Reich, all of it was being undermined by these 8 ships that should not exist. He thought of his rival, Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, who had been warning about production bottlenecks, about the need to rationalize German industry. Speer would seize upon this report as vindication of his arguments. Goring could already hear the whispered conversations in Berlin's halls of power, the quiet questions about whether the Reichsmarshal had lost his touch, whether his addictions and excesses had clouded his judgment. But there was something else, something deeper that gnawed at Goring as he sat in his palace of plundered art and manufactured grandeur. It was the realization that he had fundamentally misunderstood the enemy. He had seen the Americans as materialistic and soft, concerned only with comfort and profit. He had dismissed their democracy as weakness, their diversity as division, their capitalism as chaos. Yet somehow that chaos had produced order. That diversity had produced unity of purpose. That capitalism had produced coordination that matched or exceeded the Reich's centralized planning. As darkness fell over Carinhall, Goring lit a lamp and continued reading through supplementary reports. There were details about the shipyards themselves, sprawling facilities that employed tens of thousands. There were photographs, grainy and stamped with intelligence service markings, showing the carriers under construction. In one image, he could see a woman in coveralls welding a seam, her face hidden behind a protective mask, anonymous and yet part of something vast. Over the following days, Goring became obsessed. He canceled meetings, delegated responsibilities to subordinates who were surprised by his sudden withdrawal. In his private study, he assembled what amounted to a shrine to American industrial capacity. Charts pinned to walls, photographs arranged chronologically, production graphs that climbed at angles that seemed to defy economic gravity. Richter delivered new intelligence daily. Reports came from agents in neutral countries, from diplomatic intercepts, from German POWs who had been captured by Americans and spoke of the endless streams of equipment they had witnessed. Each report added another piece to a puzzle that Goring was beginning to realize he had been deliberately ignoring. The American automotive industry, Richter explained during one late-night session, spreading photographs across the desk. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler, they converted their assembly lines from automobiles to tanks, aircraft engines, and military trucks. The same techniques they developed for mass-producing cars they applied to weapons of war. There is a factory in Michigan that produces a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Goring's face drained of color. Every hour? A 4-engine heavy bomber. Every 63 minutes, her Reichsmarschall. The Willow Run plant. Henry Ford designed it specifically for continuous production. The assembly line is over a mile long. Richter pulled out another photograph showing an aerial view of a facility so vast it looked like a small city. They employ over 40,000 workers. Many of them are women and minorities who would never have been allowed near such work before the war. Goring stood and paced, his breathing heavy. And we told the Führer that our production was superior because of German engineering excellence. We mocked American mass production as creating inferior weapons. He laughed harshly. Quantity has a quality all its own. Isn't that what Stalin supposedly said? We thought Soviet brutality was the only way to achieve such numbers. But the Americans, they did it with worker satisfaction surveys and singing competitions and morale programs. He picked up a translated American magazine, Life, from August 1943. The cover showed a female welder, goggles pushed up on her forehead, smiling with genuine pride. The headline read, "American Women, the Secret Weapon." Goring stared at the image for a long moment, then threw it down in disgust. Not disgust at the woman, but at himself, at the Reich, at the entire edifice of assumptions that had led them to this moment. They inspired their people, he said quietly, almost to himself. We coerced ours. They asked for volunteers and received millions. We conscripted labor and called it service to the Volk. They paid good wages and created nurseries for workers' children. We used slave labor from the occupied territories and wondered why productivity remained low. Richter shifted uncomfortably. These were dangerous observations, even in private. The systems are different, Herr Reichsmarschall. The Americans have resources we lack: vast space, isolation from direct attack, access to materials from across the globe. Yes, the resources, Goring said dismissively. But resources don't weld themselves into carriers. Resources don't organize themselves into supply chains. There is something else, Klaus. Something about their system that we failed to appreciate. He returned to the window, a habit when his thoughts grew too heavy. Do you know what frightens me most about these 8 carriers? The tactical implications, Herr Reichsmarschall? No. Well, yes, but not primarily. Goring turned back to face his aide. What frightens me is that they built them openly. They didn't hide them in secret facilities. They built them in cities where thousands could see the progress. They published articles about the construction. They took pride in showing the world what they could accomplish. That's not just industrial capacity, Klaus. That's confidence. That's a nation that knows it has already won and is simply waiting for the rest of us to accept the inevitable. The room fell into uneasy silence. Finally, Richter spoke. What will you tell the Führer? Goring moved to a side table where a crystal decanter held amber liquid. He poured himself a generous measure, ignoring his doctor's warnings. I don't know yet. If I tell him the full truth, that we have catastrophically underestimated American capability, it will be seen as defeatism. I could be shot. At minimum, I will lose my position. He drank deeply. But if I conceal this information, if I allow strategic planning to proceed based on false assumptions, the consequences could be far worse. He thought of the young pilots in the Luftwaffe, boys really, many of them barely 18. They were being trained on fuel rations that grew smaller each month, in aircraft that were increasingly outmatched by Allied designs. They flew with courage that bordered on fanaticism, believing in ultimate victory because men like Goring had promised it. How many of those boys would die because he had been wrong about the enemy's strength? "I need to see more," Goring said suddenly. "I need to understand not just what they built, but how they built it. The organizational structure, the decision-making processes, the coordination between military needs and civilian production. If we are to have any chance at all, of surviving this war, we need to learn from them even as we fight them." Over the next week, Goring did something unprecedented. He requested academic papers on American industrial organization, translated articles from business journals, even pre-war studies on mass production techniques. He read about Frederick Taylor's scientific management, about Henry Ford's assembly line innovations, about the coordination between government and private industry through entities like the War Production Board. What emerged was a picture of a system that was messy and argumentative and inefficient in peacetime, but that had proven remarkably adaptable in war. The Americans had not tried to impose a rigid central plan. Instead, they had set goals and incentivized competition to meet them. Shipyards competed to complete carriers faster. Aircraft manufacturers competed to improve designs. The government coordinated through contracts and priorities, but allowed companies to innovate in their methods. It was, Goring had to admit, the antithesis of everything the Reich stood for. Yet it worked. God help him, it worked spectacularly. One evening, as snow began to fall over Carinhall, Goring summoned Richter for a conversation that would be recorded in the Oberst's private diary, never to be officially reported. "I have been thinking about what we could have done differently," Goring said, his voice tired and reflective. "Not morally, I leave those questions to philosophers and priests, but strategically, industrially. What if we had approached this war as a production problem rather than a conquest problem?" Richter sat carefully, sensing this was a moment of unusual candor. "How do you mean, Herr Reichsmarschall?" The Führer's vision was always territorial Lebensraum, the expansion of German lands. But territory is meaningless without the ability to defend and develop it. The Americans understood this. They didn't need to conquer territory because their own continent gave them everything they needed. They focused on production first, knowing that weapons would create strategic options. He paused, marshalling his thoughts. "We did the opposite. We conquered first and assumed production would follow. We seized factories in France and Poland and assumed we could integrate them into our system. But occupied workers don't produce like free workers, Klaus. Fear is not as powerful a motivator as we believed. These thoughts, Herr Reichsmarschall, they are heretical, defeatist." Goring smiled bitterly. "Yes, they are also true, and truth has a way of asserting itself regardless of ideology." He stood and walked to his wall of documents, running his finger along the production chart for Essex-class carriers. "Look at this curve. It's not linear. It's exponential. They built the first carrier in 20 months, the second in 18. By the 6th and 7th, they had reduced construction time to 14 months. They were learning, optimizing, becoming more efficient with each iteration. While we bombed their cities and hoped that would break their will. While we diverted resources to wonder weapons that would be ready soon. While we maintained parallel production of incompatible tank designs because various departments refused to cooperate." Goring's voice rose with frustration. "We had some of the finest engineers in the world, Klaus. We had scientific achievement that was the envy of nations. But we lacked the one thing that matters most in industrial war, the ability to produce at scale without sacrificing quality." He returned to his desk and pulled out a final document, one he had been avoiding. It was a projection created by his own staff of what American production would look like if current trends continued. By the end of 1944, the Americans would have more than 20 fleet carriers operational. By 1945, that number could exceed 30. Each one would be a floating air base, capable of projecting power anywhere in the Pacific or Atlantic. "We cannot win," Goring said flatly, giving voice to the conclusion he had been circling for days. "Not against this. Not against a nation that can build 8 carriers in a year while also producing tens of thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of shipping. The mathematics are inexorable. Richter's face showed alarm. Herr Reichsmarschall, if anyone overheard. I know. But between you and me, Klaus, in this room we can acknowledge reality. The question is no longer how we achieve victory. The question is how we survive defeat with something of Germany remaining. December brought a summons Goring could no longer avoid. Hitler required his presence at the Wolf's Lair, the Führer's military headquarters hidden in the forests of East Prussia. The compound was a maze of bunkers and command centers, constantly being expanded and fortified as if concrete and steel could hold back the tide that Goring now understood was coming. He arrived in a foul mood, his body aching from the flight, his mind churning with the knowledge he carried. In the briefing room, other leaders of the Reich gathered: Speer, Donitz, Keitel, Jodl, all men who still spoke in terms of victory and breakthrough. Maps showed front lines and offensive plans. No one mentioned that those lines were slowly, inexorably being pushed back. Hitler appeared in better spirits than Goring expected. There had been minor tactical successes on the Eastern Front, enough to feed the Führer's optimism. He spoke of new technologies, of jet aircraft that would sweep the skies clear of Allied bombers, of rockets that would devastate London, of supertanks that would break any enemy line. Goring listened with growing despair. All of these weapons existed, yes, in prototype or small numbers. But the Americans were producing mature weapons by the thousands while Germany chased technological dreams. It was the difference between a craftsman making a perfect sword and a factory producing reliable rifles. The sword might be superior in individual combat, but the rifles would win the war. Reichsmarschall, Hitler said, turning his intense gaze on Goring. What news from your Luftwaffe? Are the new jet fighters ready for mass production? Goring felt the weight of every eye in the room. This was the moment. He could continue the pretense, make excuses about minor setbacks and promise imminent breakthroughs. Or he could tell a truth that no one wanted to hear. Mein Führer, he began carefully. The Me-262 is an excellent aircraft, superior to anything the Allies currently fly. But production has been complicated by material shortages, by the need to train pilots in entirely new flight techniques, by the vulnerability of the engines to combat damage. He paused, gathering courage. Even if we could produce them in large numbers, which we cannot given our current industrial situation, we face an enemy whose production capacity we have consistently underestimated. Hitler's expression shifted, clouds passing across the sun. What do you mean, underestimated? Goring glanced at Richter, who stood at attention by the wall, then pressed forward. The Americans, Mein Führer. Intelligence reports have confirmed that they commissioned 8 Essex-class fleet carriers in 1943 alone. These are not small vessels but major capital ships, each carrying nearly 100 aircraft. The implications for both Atlantic and Pacific operations are significant. The room went quiet. Speer leaned forward with interest. Here was confirmation of arguments he had been making about Allied industrial might. Donitz frowned, calculating what this meant for his U-boat campaign. But Hitler's face showed something more complex. A mixture of disbelief and anger that someone would dare inject pessimism into his strategic vision. 8 carriers, Hitler repeated slowly. You are certain of this intelligence? I have verified it through multiple sources, Mein Führer. The Americans are using mass production techniques that we did not anticipate. Prefabrication, modular construction, round-the-clock shifts. They have mobilized their entire society for war production in ways that... He stopped, seeing Hitler's hand raise. Reichsmarschall Goring. Hitler's voice was cold, precise. Are you suggesting that the Americans, who could not organize a proper army until 2 years into this war, who rely on mongrel conscripts and women workers, have somehow surpassed German industrial capability? Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The trap was obvious. Agree and be labeled defeatist. Disagree and perpetuate the dangerous illusion that had brought them to this point. Goring chose a middle path, though he knew it would satisfy no one. What I am suggesting, Mein Führer, is that we have underestimated their capacity for industrial coordination. They have advantages we lack, geographic isolation from bombing, access to global resources, a large population not yet fully mobilized. They are producing quantity while we focus on quality. Historically, quantity has often quantity. Hitler's fist slammed on the table. The Soviets have quantity, endless hordes of peasants and obsolete tanks, and yet we held them for 2 years with our superior quality. Quality of equipment, quality of soldiers, quality of will. The Americans are not Soviets, mein Führer. The words came out before Goring could stop them. The room froze. Even Speer, who usually delighted in such moments of tension, looked uncomfortable. Hitler stood, his chair scraping against the concrete floor. Explain yourself, Reichsmarschall. Goring took a breath. In for a Pfennig, in for a mark. The Soviets have quantity without sophistication. They produce simple weapons and throw them at problems. The Americans, they have found a way to combine quantity with quality. Their ships are well designed. Their aircraft are reliable. Their tanks, while perhaps not equal to our Tigers individually, are produced in such numbers that they can overwhelm through attrition. And they are improving, mein Führer. Each generation of their equipment is better than the last. They are learning from combat experience faster than we can adapt. Are you telling me, Hitler's voice was dangerously quiet, that the war is lost? I am telling you that we must reconsider our strategic assumptions. If the intelligence is accurate, and I believe it is, then the Americans have production capacity that dwarfs our own. 8 carriers in 1 year suggests they can produce similar numbers of other weapons. If we continue to plan based on the belief that their industry is chaotic and inefficient, we will be caught unprepared. Speer interjected, seeing an opening. The Reichsmarschall is not wrong about their production capacity, mein Führer. My own ministry has been tracking their output. They are producing aircraft at rates that would require us to triple our current capacity merely to match. They built over 96,000 aircraft in 1943. We built approximately 25,000. Hitler whirled on Speer. Then increase production. You are the Minister of Armaments. That is your responsibility. I am trying, mein Führer, but we face material shortages, labor shortages, and constant bombing of our factories. The Americans face none of these constraints. Their industry is protected by 2 oceans. They have access to rubber from South America, oil from Texas, iron ore from Minnesota, aluminum from excuses. Hitler's voice echoed off the concrete walls. I am surrounded by defeatists and excuse-makers. Where is the fighting spirit that brought us from nothing to the masters of Europe? Where is the will that allowed us to defeat France in 6 weeks? Goring felt something snap inside him. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps the morphine wearing off, perhaps simply the weight of carrying lies for too long. That fighting spirit, mein Führer, was based on facing enemies who were unprepared and divided. We have now awakened enemies who are prepared and united. The Americans are not decadent. The British are not finished. The Soviets are not broken. And we are stretched across a continent, fighting on multiple fronts, with production that cannot match our consumption. The silence that followed was absolute. Officers stared at their boots. Maps suddenly became fascinating. Even the stenographer seemed to stop breathing. Hitler walked slowly around the table until he stood directly in front of Goring. The Reichsmarschall was larger, taller, but in that moment he felt small under the Führer's gaze. You were my comrade from the beginning, Hitler said softly. You led the Luftwaffe to victory in Poland, in Norway, in France. You promised me that England would be brought to its knees by bombing. That promise was not kept. You promised me that no enemy bomber would reach Berlin. That promise was broken. And now you come to me with tales of American superproduction and suggest that we cannot win. He paused. Tell me, Hermann, are you still capable of leading the Luftwaffe? Or have soft living and medication clouded your judgment? It was a public humiliation, calculated and cruel. Goring felt the eyes of every officer in the room, felt the satisfaction of rivals like Himmler and Bormann who were surely present or would hear of this moment. He could resign, could rage, could defend himself. Instead, he did something unexpected. My judgment may be clouded, mein Führer. I do not deny my failures. But the intelligence about American production is not opinion, it is fact. Those 8 carriers exist. They are operational. They are changing the strategic balance in the Pacific and will soon affect the Atlantic. Ignore this information if you wish, but it will not cease to be true. Hitler studied him for a long moment, then turned away. The meeting is concluded. Reichsmarschall Goring, you will remain. The room emptied quickly, officers eager to escape the tension. Even Richter was dismissed, leaving Goring alone with Hitler and the maps that showed an empire that had stopped growing. Sit, Hitler said, his voice now tired rather than angry. Both men sat, and for a moment they were not Führer and Reichsmarschall, but 2 aging men who had gambled everything and were beginning to realize the dice had not fallen in their favor. Tell me honestly, Hermann, just between us, can we win this war? Goring considered lying. It would be easier, safer. But something in Hitler's tone suggested he genuinely wanted truth, perhaps for the first time in months. Not in the way we envisioned, mein Führer. Not with total victory and a 1,000-year Reich. But we might survive it. We might negotiate a peace that leaves Germany intact, if we act soon. If we consolidate our forces, if we focus on defense rather than further conquest, if we can bloody the Allies enough that they prefer negotiation to continued casualties. Hitler absorbed this. And if we continue as we are? Then the 8 carriers are just the beginning. The Americans will land in France. They will link up with the British and push east. The Soviets will push west. And Germany will be caught between 2 forces that can replace their losses faster than we can inflict them. You paint a dark picture. I paint an honest picture. I should have painted it sooner. Hitler stood and walked to the map, his finger tracing the vast territories still under German control. We hold from the Atlantic to the Volga. We have defeated every continental power that stood against us. We have created something that Europe has not seen since Rome. And you tell me it is not enough. It was never going to be enough, mein Führer. Not against the combined resources of the Soviet Union, the British Empire, and the United States. We won quickly against divided enemies. But those enemies are divided no longer. The winter of 1943 to 1944 was bitter in more ways than meteorological. Goring returned to Carinhall a changed man, his confidence shattered by the confrontation at the Wolf's Lair. Hitler had not removed him from command. That would have been an admission that Goring's warnings carried weight. But their relationship had cooled. The Führer now consulted more frequently with Speer and other younger advisors who still spoke in optimistic terms. Goring threw himself into understanding not just the 8 carriers, but the entire American war machine. He studied their Liberty ship program, simple, mass-produced cargo vessels that were replacing sunk tonnage faster than U-boats could sink them. He examined their tank production. The Sherman was unremarkable individually, but they were producing them at rates that made tactical excellence almost irrelevant. He looked at their aircraft numbers and felt physically ill. Richter became his partner in this morbid research, bringing reports that grew increasingly dire. The Americans were training pilots faster than Germany could shoot them down. They were building bombers faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them. And those 8 carriers, those impossible symbols of industrial might, were now prowling the Pacific, reducing Japanese positions that had seemed impregnable. They are learning, Goring observed one evening, studying after-action reports from the Pacific Theater. The Americans. At Midway they won through luck and courage. At Guadalcanal they fought desperately and took heavy losses. But now, look at Tarawa, look at Kwajalein, they have developed doctrine, coordination, overwhelming force applied with precision. They don't repeat mistakes, Klaus. They adapt. While we maintain the same tactics that worked in 1940 and wonder why they fail in 1944. Dive bombing was revolutionary when we introduced it. Now the enemy has radar and fighter coverage that makes it suicidal. We pioneered blitzkrieg with tanks and aircraft in coordination. Now the enemy does it better because they can afford to lose equipment and we cannot. The morphine bottles multiplied on Goring's desk. His weight continued to increase. He took fewer meetings, made fewer public appearances. Rumors swirled in Berlin that the Reichsmarschall was ill, or had fallen from favor, or was simply overwhelmed by responsibilities he could no longer manage. The truth was simpler and more tragic. Goring was experiencing a crisis of belief. Everything he had staked his reputation on, air power supremacy, the weakness of democracies, the superiority of German engineering and will, had been proven wrong by 8 aircraft carriers and the system that produced them. In February 1944, Richter brought news that American bombers had struck Berlin in broad daylight. The raid was costly for the Americans, they lost several aircraft, but they had done it, had reached the heart of the Reich and returned. Goring's promise that no enemy plane would reach Berlin was now thoroughly, publicly broken. "They are destroying more than buildings," Goring said, watching smoke rise from the city in the distance. "They are destroying the myth of our invulnerability. Every bomb that falls on Berlin is proof that we cannot protect our own capital, much less conquer the world." He drafted a letter to Hitler that night, long and rambling, full of strategic analysis and grim projections. He detailed what the 8 carriers meant not just for naval warfare but for the entire concept of power projection. He explained how American air power, both land-based and carrier-based, was creating a network of control that Germany could not match. He argued for a strategic withdrawal, for consolidation of forces, for a negotiated peace while Germany still had leverage. The letter was never sent. Goring read it over breakfast, saw how it would be received, as defeatism, as cowardice, as betrayal, and burned it in his fireplace. Some truths, he realized, could not be spoken, even when everyone knew them. Spring came, and with it the inevitable. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces landed in Normandy. The invasion force was staggering in its scale. Thousands of ships, including several of those Essex-class carriers providing air cover, hundreds of thousands of men, equipment that seemed endless. The Atlantic Wall, which German propaganda had declared impregnable, was breached in a day. Goring was at Carinhall when he received the news. He did not rage or disbelieve. He simply nodded, as if confirming a calculation he had made months ago. "It begins," he said to Richter. "The end begins." The Luftwaffe fought bravely over Normandy, but the numbers were impossible. For every German aircraft that took to the sky, there were 10 Allied planes. Pilots who had survived Poland and France and the Eastern Front died in skies filled with enemies. The careful calculations that Goring had made about kill ratios and attrition meant nothing when the enemy could replace losses overnight. One young pilot, shot down and captured, was brought to meet Goring in a strange twist of protocol. The boy, he was only 19, had claimed before capture that he wanted to meet the great Reichsmarshal, the ace from the Great War. Perhaps sensing the propaganda value, or perhaps from morbid curiosity, Goring agreed to a brief meeting. "What is your name, son?" Goring asked, seeing in the young man's face a ghost of his own youth. "Lieutenant Hans Weber, Herr Reichsmarschall." "How many kills do you have, Lieutenant?" 11 confirmed, sir. I would have had more, but there are so many of them. For every bomber I shoot down, 2 more appear. And the fighters, they are everywhere. We cannot." He stopped, realizing he was speaking dangerously. "Cannot what?" Goring's voice was gentle, not the thunder subordinates had learned to fear. "Cannot win, sir. Not like this. I lost my entire squadron over Normandy. 6 pilots, all good men, all trained. And the next day, I saw the sky filled with American planes, so many they blocked out the sun. Where do they all come from?" Goring gestured for the guards to step back, to give them a moment of privacy. "They come from factories, Lieutenant Weber. Factories that never stop, that work through the night, that are protected by oceans and distance. They come from a nation that has mobilized every resource, every citizen, toward one purpose, our defeat." He paused. "You asked where they come from. The better question is why we did not see them coming." The young pilot looked confused. "But you are the Reichsmarschall. You command the Luftwaffe. How could you not?" "No, I knew, Lieutenant. I simply refused to accept what I knew." Goring felt something break inside him, a final dam of pretense. "Let me tell you about 8 aircraft carriers. In 1943, the Americans built 8 Essex-class carriers. Do you understand what that means?" Each one carries almost 100 aircraft. That's 800 aircraft, just from ships that didn't exist a year before. Add the land-based bombers, the fighters, the transports. They built over 85,000 aircraft in 1943 alone, while we built 25,000. Weber's face showed the same dawning horror that Goring had experienced in his study at Carinhall. But that's impossible. That's what I thought. That's what I told the Führer. That's what I convinced myself to believe because the alternative was too terrible to contemplate. Goring leaned forward. Do you know what the worst part is? It's not that we lost. Wars are won and lost. It's that we lost to an enemy we never bothered to understand. We saw them as weak because they were democratic, as disorganized because they valued freedom, as inferior because they were diverse. And all of those things we thought were weaknesses turned out to be strengths. What do I tell my men, sir? The ones who are still alive. Goring considered this. Tell them to fight honorably. Tell them to survive if they can. Tell them that Germany will need men like you to rebuild when this is over, because it will be over, Lieutenant. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. Those 8 carriers I mentioned? They were just the beginning. There are more now, and there will be more still. The tide has turned, and all we can do is try to keep our heads above water until we reach shore. The young pilot was led away, back to a POW camp where he would spend the remainder of the war. Goring never learned what became of him, but he thought often of that conversation, of the young man's face when he understood that his sacrifice, however brave, was ultimately futile against the industrial colossus they faced. Summer brought disaster after disaster. The Allies broke out from Normandy. Paris fell. Allied forces landed in southern France. The Eastern Front collapsed in Belarus. And everywhere, the American presence grew. Their trucks carrying supplies, their aircraft dominating the skies, their artillery providing endless fire support. The 8 carriers had multiplied. Intelligence now counted 16 in the Pacific alone, with more in the Atlantic. Goring attempted one last meeting with Hitler in July, shortly after the failed assassination attempt that left the Führer even more paranoid and isolated. The Wolf's Lair was now a prison of suspicion, where every officer was viewed as a potential traitor. Mein Führer, Goring began carefully. The situation requires frank assessment. The Allies are advancing on all fronts. Our production cannot match our losses. If we could negotiate from our current position, never. Hitler's voice was flat, final. We negotiate nothing. We fight to the last man, the last bullet, the last breath. Better a Germany destroyed than a Germany that surrenders. But the people, Mein Führer, the cities being bombed, the refugees fleeing. The people will understand that we fought for their future. If we surrender now, everything we built will be torn down. The Allies will dismember Germany. The Bolsheviks will impose their system. Better to fight and die than to live under such conditions. Goring looked at the man he had followed for 2 decades and saw a stranger. Or perhaps, more terrifyingly, he saw the same man he had always been, and realized that he had simply never looked closely enough. The 8 carriers, Goring said suddenly, not even sure why he brought it up again. What? Hitler's eyes focused, irritated by the non sequitur. The American carriers I mentioned last year. When I told you they had built 8 in 1 year. Do you remember what you said? I said you were making excuses. You did. And I was right, Mein Führer. About the carriers, about the production, about all of it. I was right, and we continued to plan as if I were wrong, and now look where we are. Hitler's face darkened. Are you suggesting that your pessimism was wisdom? That surrender is prudence. I am suggesting that acknowledging reality is not defeatism. Those 8 carriers have helped reduce Japanese positions across the Pacific. They have provided air cover for invasions we cannot stop. They are symbols, Mein Führer, of a nation that outthought us, outproduced us, and outfought us. Not because they were superior men, their ranks are filled with conscripts and volunteers like our own, but because their system proved more effective than ours. Their system is chaos. Democracy is weak. Then how did weak chaos defeat strong order? Goring's voice rose, months of frustration pouring out. How did the mongrel nation of shopkeepers build those 8 carriers while we struggled to build 2? How did the undisciplined Americans train pilots faster than we could kill them? How did the disorganized democratic system produce coordination that matched our central planning? Hitler stood, his hand trembling. Whether from rage or the lingering effects of the assassination attempt, Goring couldn't tell. Get out. You are relieved of operational command of the Luftwaffe. You retain your rank and titles, but you will issue no more orders. I am done with pessimists who disguise cowardice as wisdom. Goring left the wolf's lair for the last time, knowing he would not return. The empire was crumbling, and its emperor had gone mad, or perhaps had always been mad, and circumstances had simply made it obvious. The final months of the war passed in a surreal blur for Hermann Goring. Stripped of operational authority but still nominally the second man in the Reich, he existed in a strange limbo. He retreated to Carinhall, watching his collection of stolen art, paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer, sculptures from Greece and Rome, and wondered what would become of it all when the end came. The Allied advance was inexorable. The Soviets closed from the east, bent on revenge for the devastation Germany had inflicted upon them. The Americans and British pushed from the west, their supply lines maintained by ships that included those Essex-class carriers repositioned to the Atlantic once their work in the Pacific was done. The 8 had become 12, then 16, then 20. The impossible had become routine. Richter remained loyal to the end, bringing daily reports that Goring barely read anymore. What was the point? In April 1945, as Soviet artillery echoed in the distance and Berlin burned, Goring made his final decision. He sent a telegram to Hitler, suggesting that with the Führer trapped in Berlin, perhaps it was time for the designated successor to take control and negotiate surrender. It was a reasonable interpretation of protocol, but Hitler, surrounded by sycophants and lost in delusion, saw it as betrayal. The response came swiftly: arrest orders. Hermann Goring, once the second most powerful man in Nazi Germany, was now a traitor in the eyes of the regime he had helped build. Goring surrendered to American forces in May, hoping for some measure of dignity in captivity. During his interrogation, an American officer, young, competent professional, asked him about German intelligence failures. "We knew about your industrial capacity," Goring said, his voice tired. "I even wrote reports about it. 8 Essex-class carriers in 1943 alone. I showed the Führer the numbers. But knowing and accepting are different things. We knew, and we did nothing because accepting would have meant admitting we had already lost." The officer nodded, making notes. Those carriers helped win the war in the Pacific. They're already being called the most successful ship class in naval history. Goring laughed bitterly. Of course they are. And we told ourselves they were impossible. That was our great failure, not lack of intelligence, but willful blindness to intelligence we didn't want to believe. At the Nuremberg trials, Goring defended himself vigorously, attempting to salvage some dignity from the wreckage. But the evidence was overwhelming, his crimes undeniable. When asked about his greatest mistake, he gave an answer that surprised the court. "The carriers," he said. "Not building them, we couldn't have matched American production regardless. But not understanding what they represented. Those 8 ships weren't just weapons. They were proof of a system we refused to comprehend, an enemy we refused to respect, and assumptions we refused to question." On October 15, 1946, hours before his scheduled execution, Hermann Goring took cyanide in his cell. His final written words mentioned many things: his loyalty to Germany, his defiance of the victors, his role in history. But in his private journal, found later, the last entry was different. "They built 8 carriers in 1 year," he wrote. "We built a philosophy of superiority and called it strategy. In the end, steel and shipyards proved more powerful than ideology and speeches. The Americans won not because they were better men, but because they built better systems. That is the lesson we refused to learn, and it cost us everything." The journal was filed away in archives, a footnote to a footnote in history. But the 8 Essex-class carriers sailed on, some until the 1970s, enduring monuments to the industrial democracy that had proven, against all German assumptions, that chaos properly organized could defeat order poorly conceived. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel.